Have you ever felt lost, as if your choices had led you down a path with no way back? Perhaps you've made wrong decisions, trying to reach something that seems so far away, only to find yourself trapped in a cycle of regrets and uncertainties. If the answer is yes, then you will deeply connect with the journey of Jacob. This is the story of a man who, like many of us, struggled with his flaws, sought the approval of others, and for a long time used the wrong means to achieve what he wanted. Jacob was not a perfect man. He was a flawed, cunning man, full of insecurities, but throughout his life he faced his mistakes, reconciled with his past, and through that transformed from a deceiver into a patriarch of a nation. But before we tell this fascinating story, check your subscription to this channel and leave a like if this content helps you. Now let's dive into this astonishing story of a man who even dared to fight against God. From the moment Jacob was born, the world seemed to have already chosen his fate. He was the second son, but from the womb, he was already fighting to be the first. The story of Jacob and his brother Esau is more than just a sibling rivalry. It's a story of desire, competition, and the search for a higher purpose, something many of us feel in our lives. Often, we are not chosen for what we want, but we seek by any means a path that allows us to achieve our goals. The truth is, in many cases, our choices shape us more than we would like. Jacob at birth grasped Esau's heel, which in itself was already a sign of his determined and calculating nature. But that was not all that defined him. From an early age, Jacob was someone who lived in the shadow of his older brother, the strong one, and his father, Isaac's favorite. Esau, with his impulsive personality and love for adventure, contrasted with Jacob's more introspective and cunning nature. As is often the case, the comparisons between them created tensions, and even though he was the youngest, Jacob felt that in some way he needed to surpass Esau to achieve something more. When Jacob saw the opportunity to take his brother's blessing, the blessing that guaranteed leadership of the family and the privileges of the birthright, he didn't hesitate. His heart was full of desire, and his sharp mind thought about how he could manipulate the situation. Disguised with goatskins, he pretended to be Esau to deceive his father, who was already blind and vulnerable. Jacob's mistake wasn't just the deception, but the pursuit of something without understanding its true value. We don't know what Jacob's future would have been like if he had been patient, if he had waited for the right time, but his haste to achieve the blessing using the wrong means is what defined the course of his life. When Isaac finally discovered what Jacob had done, Esau's rage was immense, and Jacob had to flee to save his life. This escape wasn't just a physical flight, but a spiritual one as well. Jacob was fleeing from something deeper, the weight of his lie, the emptiness he felt from having gained something in the wrong way. And as often happens in our lives, Jacob's escape was not the solution. It only set him on a new journey of discoveries, confronting his mistakes, and more importantly, discovering his true purpose. Now alone, and with nothing but his cunning and desire to survive, Jacob set out for a distant land, with a heart torn between the fear of what the future would bring and the hope of finding something better. The doubt about who he was, about what he truly wanted to achieve, was about to be answered. And it was on this journey of solitude, far from home and family, that Jacob had his first encounter with God. That night, Jacob found himself alone in the middle of a barren field. The night sky seemed immense above him, and the silence around him was profound, almost oppressive. He lay down on a stone, using it as a pillow, something that, at any other moment, would have seemed absurd, but at that moment he was lost. His thoughts were confused, his heart restless. He had fled from his home, his family, his responsibilities, and he didn't know what the future held for him. All he had were his empty hands and a deep desire for change. As the night wore on and fatigue took over, Jacob, in a moment of deep loneliness and vulnerability, fell asleep. And it was in this state of fragility that something extraordinary happened. In the silence of the night, Jacob had a dream that would redefine his entire life. He dreamed of a ladder that connected the earth to the sky, a massive ladder with angels ascending and descending. And at the top of the ladder stood God, looking down at Jacob. God, in a moment of mercy, spoke to him. "I am the Lord, the God of your grandfather Abraham and the God of your father Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be as numerous as the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west, to the east, to the north, and to the south. And all the families of the earth will be blessed through you and your offspring." Jacob, upon hearing these words, was astonished. He couldn't comprehend how a man who had lived with so many flaws and lies could be the recipient of such a grand promise. How could this be real? Why him, someone who felt so distant from God, be chosen to continue the legacy of Abraham and Isaac? The doubt about who he was, about his identity, grew even stronger. And at the same time, a deep sense of hope began to spring up within him. When Jacob woke up, he felt different. The fear that had consumed him before was replaced by something new, a sense that God was with him, that he had chosen him for something far greater than he could imagine. Jacob didn't fully understand the meaning of what had happened, but he knew he couldn't ignore what he had experienced. He took the stone he had used as a pillow and set it up as an altar, making a vow to God. He said, "If God will be with me and will watch over me on this journey and give me bread to eat and clothes to wear and bring me safely back to my father's house, then the Lord will be my God." What Jacob didn't know at that moment was that he was about to embark on a journey of self-discovery, growth, and transformation that would lead him back to his land, but in a completely different way than he had imagined. He still had much to learn, many lessons to absorb, but at that moment he felt God's presence like never before. And perhaps that sense of belonging was the first step toward the real change he so desperately needed. Jacob got up, looked around, and with a heart now filled with a new hope, he moved forward. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew he was no longer alone. And that dream, that vision of the ladder connecting heaven to earth, would be something he would carry with him forever, as a reminder that God had chosen him, a man so imperfect, to do great things. Jacob continued on his way, now with renewed hope, but still with many doubts about the future. He was traveling to Haran, where his uncle Laban lived, and he knew this would be an opportunity to start a new life. But, as often happens in our lives, even with the promise of a fresh start, difficulties and challenges soon appeared. Upon arriving in Haran, Jacob found a field full of shepherds, and among them was a woman who caught his eye, Rachel, Laban's daughter. She was the woman Jacob fell in love with at first sight, and he quickly knew she was the key to his future in Haran. Jacob, with his cunning ways, didn't take long to approach Laban, his uncle. They quickly recognized each other, and as is customary among family, Jacob was welcomed with generosity. During the first days in Haran, Jacob worked for Laban, taking care of the sheep and helping with whatever was needed, but something inside him was restless. He knew the life he had left behind was behind him, a life marked by deceit and rash decisions. But deep inside, Jacob still carried that desire to achieve something greater, something that would give him security and purpose. And it was in this environment, with the days passing and relationships growing, that Jacob made a request to Laban. He wanted to marry Rachel, Laban's younger daughter, the one he had fallen deeply in love with. In an act of great commitment, Jacob offered to work for 7 years to earn her hand in marriage. Laban, seeing Jacob's dedication, accepted the proposal, but with one condition. He would have to work for 7 long years to be able to marry Rachel. This 7-year period passed quickly for Jacob. The love he felt for Rachel gave him the strength to work diligently, and he believed he was finally building the future he desired. But things don't always go as planned. At the end of the 7 years, Jacob was eager to celebrate the marriage. But it was then that Laban, in an act of cunning, gave him his older daughter Leah instead of Rachel. Jacob was deceived on the wedding night, and only the next morning did he discover that instead of Rachel, he had married Leah. Disappointment and anger took hold of Jacob, and he immediately confronted Laban. Laban then revealed the reason for his deception. Here, it is not customary to marry off the younger daughter before the older one. An unexpected blow to Jacob, who felt the harshness of life making its presence felt once again. He, who had deceived his father Isaac, now felt the weight of dishonesty, the weight of a deceit being imposed on him. However, instead of giving in to despair or anger, Jacob did what seemed to be the only option. He agreed to work another 7 years, this time to marry Rachel, the woman he had always desired. This situation perfectly reflects the everyday situations in which we find ourselves at a disadvantage, where the circumstances seem to be against us. Sometimes we find ourselves trapped by wrong choices made in the past or by unexpected situations that challenge us to move forward. Jacob, now living with the pain of deceit and having to pay a high price for his decisions, was learning, in a difficult way, that life is not just about what we want, but about what is given to us and what we do with it. He still didn't know it, but this experience of working another 7 years and marrying Rachel would be just the beginning of a process of maturation and transformation that would lead Jacob to true inner change. At the end of these additional 7 years of work, Jacob finally married Rachel, and now the course of his life began to take different directions. The choices he had made up until then were marked by hardships and deceit, but God was present, shaping Jacob in a silent yet firm way. He still had much to learn, and his story of self-discovery was just beginning. With Rachel by his side, Jacob felt that he could finally begin to build the family and life he had always dreamed of. Jacob was now married to Rachel, but the love he felt for her could not erase the fact that the rivalry with Leah, his other wife, continued to grow. Leah, despite being less loved by Jacob, had given birth to 4 sons: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Rachel, desperate to bear children, saw her years of marriage pass without being able to give her husband a child. Rachel's jealousy and frustration grew, and in a moment of desperation, she offered her servant Bilhah to Jacob, suggesting that he have children with her so that she could have the honor of bearing children, even if through a servant. Bilhah then gave birth to 2 sons, Dan and Naphtali. But the rivalry between Leah and Rachel did not diminish. Leah, feeling the need to compete, also offered her servant Zilpah to Jacob, and she bore 2 sons, Gad and Asher. In total, Jacob now had 6 sons, and his house was marked by rivalries, jealousy, and struggles for Jacob's attention. Eventually, Rachel, who could no longer bear the pain of being barren, asked Jacob to pray to God so that she could have a child. God heard her prayers, and Rachel finally became pregnant. She gave birth to Joseph, the son Jacob loved most. Rachel died while giving birth to their 2nd son, Benjamin, and Jacob's heart was broken. Joseph and Benjamin were the 2 sons of his favorite wife, and this unconditional love for Joseph would cause problems that would later take over the entire family. The situation in Jacob's house was tense. Polygamy and the rivalry between the wives had created an environment filled with jealousy and frustration. Jacob, the man who had deceived his father, now found himself at the center of a house full of deceit and disputes, and this affected his children. The divisions among his children were also beginning to manifest, especially in regard to Joseph, Rachel's beloved son. Jacob's favoritism for Joseph would lead to even more problems, and the situation he had tried to avoid, the pain of causing suffering in his own home, was about to intensify. But despite the conflicts and family pain, God was working behind the scenes. Each son of Jacob, every story of suffering and frustration, had a purpose. The tribes of Israel were being formed, and although the difficulties and conflicts were part of the journey, God was shaping the future of Israel through Jacob and his sons. It was a long and difficult process, but in the midst of it all, God continued to guide them. Jacob, who throughout his life had struggled to gain love and blessings, now found himself in an even greater struggle, the struggle for the unity of his family. But as always, Jacob's past choices still reflected in his present, and the situation he was living with his wives and children served as a reminder that often what we do in moments of weakness or in search of something we desire can have repercussions for generations. The years passed, and Jacob found himself building a life in Haran, but the restlessness within his heart never left him. The difficulties in his family life, with the constant rivalry between his wives and children, troubled him. But there was something deeper, consuming him. He knew that there was more to his life, a divine promise to be fulfilled. And then, in a moment of reflection, Jacob felt that it was time to return to his homeland, the land that God had promised to him and his ancestors. It was time to start over. God had appeared to Jacob in a dream, promising him that he would be with him, protect him, and bring him back to the land of his fathers. God's word had penetrated deeply into Jacob's heart, and he felt that he could no longer delay his return. But as always, feelings of fear and insecurity were also present. Returning to his homeland meant he would have to face his brother Esau, whom he had deceived many years before. The fear that Esau still harbored resentment over his betrayal consumed him. He knew he would have to confront the past, and that terrified him. With his heart full of doubt, Jacob called his wives and children and told them about his decision. Although his family had grown and settled in Haran, he knew that God's will was clear. It was time to move forward. But Jacob also knew that his father-in-law Laban's reaction would not be easy. He had worked for Laban for years, and this decision to leave could be seen as a betrayal. However, Jacob knew that he had to follow the divine calling, regardless of the consequences. When Laban learned of Jacob's departure, he became furious. But Jacob, with a tense heart and aware of the possible difficulties ahead, could no longer allow himself to be controlled by fear. He had spent so long trying to win his father-in-law's love, and now he needed to free himself from that dependence. Jacob knew the journey back would be difficult, and what terrified him the most was not only confronting Laban, but facing his own past. The lies, the deceptions, and the weaknesses that had marked him throughout his life were now a burden he could no longer carry without confronting them. Leaving Haran, Jacob knew the road ahead would not be easy. He no longer had the material possessions he once had, but what he had now was something far more precious, the promise of God's presence with him. For Jacob, this meant more than any treasure he could ever gain. He knew that despite his past mistakes, God was with him and would guide him back to his homeland. The decision to return home was in fact more than just a physical move. It was the beginning of a spiritual journey. Jacob was about to face the ghosts of his past, confront the unhealed wounds, and finally seek redemption. And as often happens in our lives, the decisions that scare us the most, those that involve confronting our own mistakes and weaknesses, are the ones that lead us to the greatest growth and transformation. Jacob was starting to realize this, but his inner struggle was far from over. Jacob's path was full of challenges and difficult decisions, but the greatest test was yet to come. As he approached the land of his ancestors, fear and anxiety took over his heart. He knew he would have to meet Esau, the brother he had deceived, the one he had betrayed so cruelly. Jacob did not know what to expect. Would it be a meeting of reconciliation, or, as he feared, a deadly confrontation? The weight of regret and guilt pressed heavily on his soul. Every step he took toward the meeting with Esau felt like a reminder that he had not lived with integrity. Jacob's decision was difficult, but necessary. He needed to face his past. He needed to reconcile with his brother, and above all, he needed to ask for forgiveness. It was as if by facing Esau, he was also confronting his own mistakes and seeking an inner peace that had long escaped him. Jacob knew he could not control Esau's behavior, but he could do his part to try to ease the situation. With this thought, Jacob began sending messengers ahead to Esau, offering him gifts. He sent hundreds of sheep, goats, cows, and camels, all in an attempt to appease his brother's anger. Jacob, with a sincere heart, thought that by showing his humility and regret, perhaps Esau might somehow forgive him. He wanted to avoid the worst, a violent confrontation that could destroy everything he had built. Jacob's strategy, though based on fear, was also a reflection of his desire for change, to seek forgiveness, and to correct a mistake that had haunted him for so long. As the messengers departed, Jacob began to prepare even further for the encounter with his brother. The fear he felt was not only of rejection, but of facing the consequences of his deception. He knew that the wounds of the past would not heal overnight. Still, the hope for reconciliation, for something better, kept him moving forward. The night before the encounter, Jacob could not sleep. The fear that his brother might come with an army of vengeance filled his thoughts. He prayed to God, acknowledging his mistakes and asking for his protection. He said, "Lord, deliver me from the hands of my brother Esau, for I fear that he may come and attack me with the women and the children." It was a moment of desperation, but also of surrender. For the first time in a long while, Jacob was completely placing himself in God's hands, trusting that he would take care of his future. It was as if, by asking for help, Jacob was acknowledging that he could no longer fight the mistakes of his past alone. And it was on that night of agony, when he felt most vulnerable and weak, that the unexpected happened. Jacob had a supernatural encounter. He was alone in the camp when something inexplicable occurred. A figure appeared and began to wrestle with him. The fight lasted throughout the night, and what started as a physical struggle soon turned into something much deeper. Jacob was no longer just fighting the fear of his brother. He was wrestling with his own past, with the deceptions that had defined his life, and above all, with his nature, which always sought to control and manipulate situations to get what he wanted. This struggle was a turning point for Jacob. Throughout his life, he had been clever and deceitful, but now he found himself face to face with the truth of who he really was. The fight was not just against a man, but against everything he had been, against pride, against his failures, against the wrong choices that had brought him to this point. He did not know that by fighting until dawn, he was undergoing a spiritual transformation, something he would later understand as the battle for his own redemption. When the man, the angel of God, saw that Jacob would not give up, he touched Jacob's thigh and dislocated it, marking him forever. But Jacob, now spiritually stronger, refused to let go of the mysterious figure until he was blessed. Then, in an act of mercy, the man gave him a new identity. "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have fought with God and with men, and have prevailed." Jacob, now with his thigh wounded, but with a new vision and a new identity, understood that the struggle was not just to change his external circumstances, but to change his heart. He was no longer the man who deceived, but someone transformed by God's grace. His journey of self-overcoming was just beginning, and he knew that although the future was uncertain, he would face nothing without the presence of God. The following morning, Jacob rose, feeling the pain in his thigh, a reminder of his struggle with the angel. He had been physically touched, But what marked him most was the internal transformation that experience brought. The new name, Israel, now symbolized something greater than a mere change of identity. It was a sign of the transformation he had undergone by facing his fears, his mistakes, and finally surrendering to God's will. He was no longer the man who tried to control every situation, but someone who, through divine grace, was becoming stronger, more humble, and more aware of his purpose. Jacob's struggle had been a profound spiritual battle. He wrestled with his own ego, his tendency to manipulate life to get what he wanted, his need for recognition, and his fear of facing the past. Rather than fighting against others, Jacob found himself for the first time battling himself, confronting not just an angel but the truth of who he was. He had sought God's blessing in so many wrong ways throughout his life. And now, in the middle of the darkness, he finally understood that God wanted something different from him. God wanted surrender, not manipulation, humility, not deceit. Jacob, now wounded but with a renewed heart, felt an unexpected peace. His encounter with the angel was not just a physical struggle, but a metaphor for his entire life up to that point. By being touched and having his name changed to Israel, Jacob became a new person, someone ready to fulfill the divine promise made to his ancestors. As dawn broke, Jacob continued his journey. He didn't know exactly what to expect, but he was now better prepared for what lay ahead. The pain in his thigh was not just a reminder of the struggle, but also of the victory. He had faced adversity, and it had not destroyed him, but transformed him. Jacob was now more connected with God than ever before, and knew that his journey was no longer about deceit or control, but about trusting and following divine direction. With a calmer heart, Jacob moved forward toward his meeting with Esau. He was no longer obsessed with the idea of being accepted or of correcting every mistake from his past, because, in a sense, he had already been transformed by God's mercy. He knew that Esau's forgiveness was important, but the true forgiveness Jacob needed had already been given: God's forgiveness. The meeting with Esau drew closer, and Jacob felt the weight of the responsibility not only to restore his relationship with his brother, but also to restore his own identity. He would no longer be Jacob, the deceiver, but Israel, the one who wrestles with God and prevails. This was the defining moment, the ultimate test of his transformation. Finally, the long-awaited moment arrived. Jacob stood before what he feared most, the reunion with Esau. That man, his brother, whom he had deceived years ago, was now standing before him. Jacob had sent gifts, devised a strategy, and even asked for God's help to soften Esau's heart. But now, deep down, he knew there was nothing more he could do. Whatever would happen next would be the result of years of actions, regrets, and ultimately his pursuit of redemption. With a heavy heart, Jacob began preparing for the meeting. He separated his family and belongings, placing the most vulnerable, like his wives and children, at the front in the hope that if something went wrong, they would be protected. Jacob, the man who once used tricks and deceit to achieve his goals, was now standing before his past, ready to face the consequences. But what Jacob did not know, and what he could never have expected, was that Esau, upon seeing him from afar, would approach with a smile on his face and without hesitation embrace him. Esau, with an unexpected gesture, threw himself into Jacob's arms with genuine forgiveness, without resentment. This moment was a shock of mercy for Jacob, who could hardly believe what was happening. For so many years, he had imagined a violent reunion, a vengeance that could have been disastrous for them both. But instead, he was met with forgiveness and compassion. "I've moved past all of it," Esau said. "There is no more resentment between us." Esau's forgiveness was not just an act of reconciliation between brothers, it was the final piece of the puzzle Jacob needed to complete. Throughout his journey, Jacob had wrestled with himself, his lies, and the pain he had caused his brother. Now, as Esau embraced him, Jacob experienced true grace, the kind of grace that comes only when we release the burden of the past and learn to live in the present. With tears in his eyes, Jacob felt the magnitude of this forgiveness. It was as if he had been freed from a burden he had carried for years. He, the man who had spent so much time trying to manipulate and control situations, now found himself before an act of pure generosity. Esau had forgiven him without asking for anything in return. At that moment, Jacob realized that no matter how much we try to control the world around us, there are moments when forgiveness and reconciliation are the true sources of transformation. He understood that Esau's gesture was a reflection of God's love and grace, something he was still learning to fully grasp. The reconciliation did not happen because Jacob deserved it. It happened because, throughout his journey, he had learned to wrestle with himself, trust in God, and seek a path of righteousness. True forgiveness, both from God and from Esau, was not conditioned on worthiness, but on repentance and a genuine desire for change. This was the pivotal moment in Jacob's life. He had sought forgiveness from everyone around him, but now he understood that the greatest forgiveness came from God himself, and that by accepting the transformation God offered, he was finally becoming someone capable of forgiving others as well. This reunion between Jacob and Esau not only restored their relationship, but also sealed Jacob's journey from a deceiver to a patriarch who had learned to trust in God. It was a moment of healing for both brothers, and more than that, it was the turning point where Jacob clearly saw that peace and forgiveness are the greatest gifts we can receive and give in our lives. After reuniting with Esau, Jacob experienced a peace he never thought he would attain. The burden of his mistakes was eased by God's grace and the reconciliation with his brother. He now looked toward the future with a new perspective. The land that God had promised to his ancestors lay ahead, and Jacob knew that his mission was far from over. He was no longer the man who ran from the consequences of his actions, but someone who now carried the responsibility of leading a nation. Jacob's life, though marked by hardships and deceit, was filled with moments of learning and growth. He knew that his journey of transformation would not be easy, but he was ready to move forward as Israel, the man who wrestled with God and prevailed. Each of his children had an important role in fulfilling the divine promise. The 12 tribes of Israel were being formed, and Jacob, as their patriarch, understood that his role was not just to guide his family, but to lead a nation that would become a blessing to all the families of the earth. Jacob's life also teaches us something profound about forgiveness and transformation. He, who once sought power and the birthright through deceit, now knew that his true strength came from humility, repentance, and trust in God. Through his struggles, he learned to be more than a leader. He became a man who understood the importance of compassion, reconciliation, and above all, faithfulness to God's promise. God never abandoned him, even in the moments when he failed the most. Through his journey, Jacob came to understand that God's faithfulness is unconditional. As Jacob's story progressed, he became a model of faith, not because of his perfect actions, but because, even in his moments of failure, he repented and followed God's path. Jacob's journey was marked by mistakes, but also by genuine repentance, and this change of heart was what God used to fulfill his promises. The tribes of Israel that would come from his children would become the foundation of a great nation. And even amid challenges, Jacob's trust in God became an example for future generations. Jacob's legacy was not built through his successes, but through his ability to learn from his mistakes, repent, and follow God's will. He was not perfect, but through divine grace, he became the man who fulfilled the role God had for him. Through Jacob, God demonstrated that even those who fail, even those who are lost, can be restored and used for great things. Jacob's legacy as Israel is not just of a man who wrestled physically, but of a man who wrestled for his faith and his family, ultimately finding peace and purpose. And so Jacob, now certain that God had fulfilled his promises, prepared himself for the future. He knew the road ahead would not be easy, but he was ready. Because above all, he knew that God was with him, and that was the greatest promise he could receive.